Well, good morning. Welcome, everybody, today. I want to remind you that, can you hear? Everybody can hear? I want to remind you that the upper room is open for special prayer requests, and I think Earl is there, so please take that, make yourself available to that if you wish. I really appreciate so much Greg stepping in last week, sort of at a short notice, and doing a dual class with the teens and this group, sort of taking a pause from Ephesians last week. I listened to the class online, and I liked the class, and the comments were insightful. That was a good class. And the week before, Stephen, I don't see Stephen, but he did a great job covering the last 12 verses of Ephesians 5. And he talked about the implications of the marriage relationship between a man and a woman, and also the beautiful analogy to Christ in the church. And so Paul is right now really in the middle of expressing the seriousness of relationships with groups of people. And so today in Ephesians 6, 1 through 9, we're going to continue that. We're going to talk first about the relationship between parents and children, and then I certainly want to get to talk about the relationship between slaves and masters. So let's start out by reading Ephesians 6, 1 through 9. Would somebody do that for me? Loud voice. Stephen, thank you.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, and sincerity of heart as to Christ. Not with eye service, as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God in the heart, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he's slave or free. And you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality.
Just like everything else, I look when you start studying these passages, you look and say, oh, there's only 9 verses here. What are we going to talk about? And I think you guys who prepare these lessons, you kind of agree that then after you get into it, you wonder, how are we going to get through all this? There's so much to unpack here, but it's a beautiful passage. Let's start with verse 1, obviously. Who is supposed to be in subjection to whom?
Children to parents.
Children to parents. They're supposed to be submissive to parents, and submissiveness is sort of the willing subjection of an inferior to one who has the right to command. So in this case, as Ryan says, children are inferior to their parents who have the right to command them. The idea here, Paul says so many remarkable things in these 9 verses. And I mean, I'm going to use the word revolutionary a lot probably today. You'll probably get tired of it. But he does do some things that are very remarkable. And one thing he does is the fact that even addressing children here is remarkable. Normally at this time in history, all instruction came from parents and not a third party like Paul. And the very fact that he is addressing in this letter children tells us, I think we can naturally deduce that he is actually addressing children who are listening to this letter being read in the churches. There were children in the assembly at this time. So I think we can naturally see that. Okay, what is the command? What is the specific command that Paul makes of children? Obey. All right, that's important. What does that mean to you?
Listen to them.
Sorry, Margo.
Listen to them and
do as they say.
Listen and do as they say. Absolutely. He has this phrase, in the Lord. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? He doesn't say obey your parents. He says obey your parents in the Lord. What does that mean? David?
To me, it sort of has a two-pronged or two-point reference or implication. One of them is so children, because you are in the Lord, meaning you're subordinate to Jesus Christ and God your Father, you should obey. That's one. But I think another aspect is to the parents is to obey the parents as those parents conform and follow the Lord. So it's I kind of see it both.
It is
to both perspectives.
very much a dual thing.
In 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about a widow. If her husband passes, she can marry whoever she wishes, only in the Lord. The in the Lord idea is this has to be a Christian. So you're really obeying your parents as Christian. As Christian parents. So you could have unchristian or non-Christian parents.
Right.
That would be a different scenario.
Right. Okay. John.
I see it as, even if you don't always agree with your parents, do it as if you're doing it unto the Lord, like you're obeying it for the Lord's sake.
I think there's a real parallel here. So we're going to get to masters and slaves with this. There's a parallelism here that's probably right. Okay, what else? Ryan, you had a comment.
Yeah. Yes. Remember the Lord first in all of this. There'll be times where your parents or your boss or whoever will want you to go in a way that's not good, and to be able to know which is which, you have to be in the Lord all the time.
Right, absolutely. This is an interesting passage because it has been variously interpreted, and I think you guys have really covered the ground on sort of ways, little nuances there of how it's interpreted. I think Paul is really here when he's writing this letter. He's assuming that the parents the children are in Christian family. I think that's kind of his basic assumption here. But I think there's some other implications about obedience that are really important. Why does he call obeying your parents right? What does that mean to you? I get to just ask questions. I don't have to answer these, right? Why does he call it right?
The Lord will never steer you wrong. So.
Right. Correct. Yes.
See, well, part of it is, it was a command in the Old Testament time here.
Yes.
And that's the main thing. And part of the Jewish tradition in Paul's day and age was you can ignore your parents and give alms to God and do other things and just bypass that command. Paul's saying, no, this is what God's command is. This is the way it ought to be.
What was that term? It slipped my mind. You brought up the term, the Jewish, people were ignoring, taking care of their parents. Yes, korban. That's it. Good. Thank you. Yeah.
Korban is basically something that's dedicated to the Lord.
Right.
So what they were doing was basically signing over their property to the temple. They can use it as they like, as they live, but afterwards, after the person passed away, all this property would be dedicated to the Lord.
Right.
And if he did that, he could get away with not helping his parents with his property.
It was a loophole to avoid taking care of your parents, kind of like setting up a temple money market fund, that you could take out, but you say, oh, no, I can't use that to help my parents because, that's dedicated to the Lord. Interesting there. Okay, what is the first of the 10 commandments that he talks about to have a condition or promise? The answer is pretty simple here. It's verse 2. Which is the first of the 10 commandments that has a condition or promise associated with it? Honor your father and mother. And I think maybe Stephen said Old Testament, of course, that's from the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20:12, and then it's repeated in Deuteronomy 5, I think verse 21, the same thing. So it's the idea that, it's a very important type relationship. It's grounded in Old Testament truth and in the very basic in the Ten Commandments itself. Okay, so I guess the idea here too is that you can look at that as when he talks about the first commandment with a promise, you can look at it as it's the first one that has a promise associated with it. The other ones are very much simple, but Moses actually mentions this idea that there's a promise associated with the commandment. And it also could be, Paul could also be referring to, it could be the first commandment that Christian parents taught their children. This is the first thing, let's memorize, children, and here's the first thing I want you to memorize. There's probably a little bit of truth in that as well.
It keeps parents from breaking another commandment. That's not like kill.
Okay. Well said. I can't talk about that one. That's true. Okay. The other thing, I guess, is that children overall would owe their parents respect and honor and obedience, and really try not to cause them any pain. Penny.
The Jews had a lot of commandments about teaching their children. They were to have scripture on the doorposts and the lintels on the sides of the doors. The holidays were a time to teach the children about what God had done for them. And the children were to ask their parents questions, and the parents, there was an opportunity for the parents to teach. So this goes two ways. It's the parents' responsibility to teach and nurture the children. It's the children's obligation to obey the parents. And to us, the white hairs in here, that just makes sense. But if you look at society today, there are other outside influences that are trying to take children away from parents,
Right.
to diminish the parents' role in the lives of the children. And as a society, we're getting away from this. It's very concerning.
Right. Absolutely.
When I was growing up in the neighborhood, there's a lot of other boys my age, and every parent in that neighborhood had the permission to spank me if I missed a leg.
It's my neighborhood also. Yes.
And I learned it. And I think those parents got together and they planned that for us. But that's all broken today. There's no trust between parenthood
Right.
and other parents. It's lost its way based on the decay of our culture away from God's way.
Yes.
And then, so even it can get so bad that the parents are so bad that the child has to be making decisions that are tough with their parents.
I've actually seen that in some, occasionally a student will share situation, and they've had to grow up in situations that I haven't ever seen, and in many cases have to be, just as you said, the parent to broken. The child has to be the parent to the broken parents, the biological parents.
There's a case that we just studied about Asa, King Asa,
Mm-hmm.
who had to depose his own mother
Right.
from Queen Mother because she was an idolater,
Right.
or idolatress.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, a good case there. All right. What's the promise? We talk about a promise associated with this command. What is the promise associated with command to obey? Long life, right?
Good life and long life.
Good life and long life. And again, this is directly out of the Ten Commandments and directly out of Deuteronomy. Let me ask you this. How practically is this true? If you obey your parents, you'll get a long life and good life. How practically is that true? Is it true?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. How does that play out? Anybody have any ideas about that?
You don't get stoned to death.
You don't get stoned to death. Yeah, and that's not facetious, you know. And in the Old Testament, that was a possibility, a very real possibility for a disobedient son or daughter.
Modern day, listening to your parents, eventually learn not to wander out into traffic.
Right?
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah, that's true. Yes, don't. Yeah, listen to me when I say there's a busy street in front of our house. Don't go out playing football in the middle of the street.
Let's say you obey your parents by not going to that crazy teenage party. You might
Yeah.
find yourself not getting killed.
Yeah. There's a bit of parents generally, and we give them some exceptions today, but generally have a little bit of wisdom. You know, the old thing about you've heard the old story about the person that said that thought his parents were crazy, and then he grew up. He was about 25, and he said maybe they weren't so crazy. There's a better way to tell that story.
The saying, the older I get, the smarter my parents become.
Hey, there you go. That's a lot better way to say it.
So parents, no parent is perfect,
Mm-hmm.
and they all make mistakes. And yet, when you look at it in the totality, the parents, generally speaking, have more experience and more wisdom. So when the parents say nothing good happens after midnight to the kids,
Yeah.
And then something bad happens, that's a reality. The parents are way more often than not correct or better, and the advice that we give is way more often than not better than what a impetuous 12
Exactly.
or 15 or even 20-year-old.
Exactly.
Parents have a vested interest, don't they?
Right. Yeah. But you should have a vested interest.
I'd rather my parents should be correct me as 12 people I don't know.
All right. That's a good way to look at it, Bernie. That's a great point. Yeah.
Parents, you got your best interest.
Yeah. You
Those
take.
12 people, they got to go, but you got the rules, the law at heart.
Yeah. You'd rather have your parents than a jury of your peers. Yes.
Well, see, there's another side of it too. Last week we were talking about the order, God's order of things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in a Christian home at a point. I ended up in a Christian home. But if a Christian doesn't act like a Christian and teach like a Christian and you know, biblically live,
Sure.
speak and teach, there's consequences. And then what happens is, you know, I'm in my 20s and 30s and 40s, and I'm going, how is it that my sisters who grew up in the same home haven't had these difficulties in their life
Right.
that I have? Well,
Right.
it's because I didn't live biblically,
Right.
you know, and so
Right.
I didn't teach my kids biblically.
Right.
So when a person knows Jesus, and knows what the word is, and can teach by example and word, then that child has something that, I mean, it's evident.
Right.
It's not just theory, it's evident, you know. in the
Right.
way
It's
that-
ingrained.
I mean, it's
Sure,
right there.
sure.
You can see it.
Right.
You can see it as it works in your life.
Right.
You can see it as it works in your parents' life.
Right.
You can see it and the benefits that come.
Exactly.
You know, life does not have to be so freaking hard.
Yeah. That's right.
You know, God didn't, you know, he's not saying things are gonna be easy, but he also said, if you follow my ways, then you'll have so much less trouble.
Yeah. I think that's the general principle.
Situation.
I think that's the general principle there. Earl.
You know, one of my daughter-in-laws, in raising their kids, she would always tell the kids, if you disobey me, you're disobeying God.
Mm-hmm. General principle there. General principle there. It's good. Let me talk to you a little bit, Marie.
It's the parents' responsibility to make sure that the children obey them. They need to live the right kind of life, but they can't leave it up to the children just by telling them to obey me. You've got to make sure that they do somewhat.
Walk the walk, talk the talk. Kind of that's the idea there.
The parents have to be on the same page.
Right.
Have to be in the
Exactly.
Bible and the word.
Exactly.
And be doing the same thing, whatever. I
Sure.
tell you something, that's just like Susie telling you something. If Susie tells you something, it's just like me telling you something.
Right. Right.
So it has to be one.
Right.
I think it's interesting that the next verse, verse 4, is a corrective to parents who may be not doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, we're going to hit that in just a second. One thing I want to do is just quickly give you a little bit of a context of what society Paul was writing in at this time. It helps us, I think, understand this even better, and particularly about living so that you may have a long life. That was especially true at the time of the Romans. And the Christian faith did so much to elevate the place of women in society, and maybe even did more for children. And in the Roman period where Paul wrote this, it was a very dangerous time. The father had absolute power over a son or daughter. And he could sell his children as slaves. He could work them in the fields. He could put them in chains. He could even have them put to death on his whim. He had that kind of power. This power of a Roman father extended over the person's entire life, the child's entire life. That child might be a mayor of a city or magistrate in a city. That child might be a Roman senator with full honors. And as long as his father lived, he was in subjection to that father. And that father had power of life and death over that Roman senator even. And this is the way that the world worked at this time. And Paul knew all about this. So how did the power play out? First of all, when a Roman baby was born, it was placed at a Roman father's feet. And if the father stooped and lifted the child up, then it was accepted. But if the Roman father looked at that baby and turned away, that child was repudiated and potentially thrown out. A Roman baby always ran the risk between life and death. And just as a 21st century baby, I think, has the same situation. If it's unwanted, it's subject to the scourge of abortion. In previous lessons, we talked about how, and it's been mentioned today, how the marriage, I think Penny mentioned this, the marriages deteriorated, the concept of marriage. And it was at this time in Rome that men and women could very easily change partners. One woman was known to have had 23 husbands legally. And so under these circumstances, oftentimes an unborn child was looked at as a burden. And so if the family rejected the child, children were commonly left at the Roman Forum to either die of exposure or they became property of anybody that would collect them. And they were often collected at night by people who would nurse them and raise them up to be children, and then they would be sold as slaves or even male or female prostitutes. Now that's pretty bleak. That's a pretty bleak environment that Paul is writing about right now. There were, in fact, like most of modern Europe and Japan, China, even the U.S., the number of children per family are falling off to a point where the birth rate's not replacing the death rate. There's a demographic cliff coming in all these countries. And so, it's interesting that even at the time of Rome, at this time that Paul wrote, a childless couple could not get their full inheritance. They were not allowed to get their full inheritance. There was an incentive to have children, but it didn't play out very well. If things were bleak for healthy children, ancient civilization was brutal to sickly or deformed children. A Greek writer, Seneca, said children who are born weakly or deformed should be drowned. They had very little chance of survival in this world. People today, and we know this all instinctively, people are intolerant of Christianity. They're very nasty in their comments online and everything now. We're hitting really some headwinds in terms of our society versus Christianity. They're bolder and bolder in their attacks. So if they ask, well, what has Christianity done for the world? Among many, many things, one thing that we can say is that it caused the change of status of women and children and any other undesirables. So that's very important. Okay, with that going on, look at verse 4. Someone's mentioned already verse 4 and the responsibility of fathers. Why do you think fathers are singled out here?
They're the chief, the head of the family.
They're the head of the family, right?
They had maybe the single most impact, the single greatest impact on families and the culture.
Greatest impact. Okay, good. What else?
Could be a translation thing, because mine says or parents. Could be a translation thing, because mine says or parents.
Or parents?
Fathers or parents.
Yeah, I think the principle is there, but I think there's a reason to me that Paul uses fathers here.
Paul has to say this because this was a problem.
Yeah.
He doesn't, he's not just saying this to say this. This has to have been
Right.
an issue and a problem
Right.
within,
Exactly.
with fathers within the Christian homes.
John, did you have another comment at the end of yours? Okay, I thought I may have cut you off in the middle of a comment there. Okay, good. Yeah, the principle certainly applies. Here's the thing that I think you probably need to think about here is that I believe that fathers are a little bit more harsh than their mothers are with children. There's probably a little bit more ability to exasperate your kids with a father than a mother. I can speak from even maybe personal experience, right? We fathers are sometimes a little bit harsh many times, and that's a difficulty. So I think all of those are true. Let me ask you this. How can you provoke your children or exasperate your children, some translations say? What does it mean?
I see it in parents who tease their kids
Mm-hmm.
and laugh at them when they do things that they just told them to do,
Right,
or mock them for not being able to do things that they tell them to do.
right.
And that really always hurts me. I feel like jumping in and saying, stop.
Yeah, just don't do that.
We do it. And really, it's almost like some fathers that I know have done this where they feel like that's training them up. That's getting tough. I'm toughing them up.
Yeah.
Well, are you toughing them up, or are you just expressing
Exasperating them. Yeah.
Oh, sarcasm.
Yeah, same kind of thing.
Wildly inconsistent standards.
Yeah.
Very inconsistent. That's a way to really, yeah. You're not consistent one day to the next. Yeah, that's a real problem. There's an interesting thing. I read one commentary that had an interesting view. Take it for what it's worth, because that's all it's worth. But he had the idea that Paul writes with such passion here in this verse that perhaps Paul was talking autobiographically here. You think about Paul probably was raised in a very Orthodox Christian home, may have been in a situation where he was really dealing maybe with perhaps a very harsh father. And there's some speculations all it is, but he said maybe fathers, you need to have a little bit of tenderness along with your teaching. Okay. One commentator, I like this. I'm going to give you 4 ways we can discourage our children and promote hostility. We mentioned some. To Greg's point about being harsh or cruel or humiliating them, another one mentioned is we can exercise too much control, and they can't grow up. And it's a delicate balance for parents between training them and then showing that we trust them and then letting go. But if we let go too early, then they lose the guardrails. So that's a very delicate balance for a parent. Very delicate, how that works. Too much control, too little control. I've always heard this: being a parent, parenting is not for sissies, and that's really true. The other thing I read was that interesting was that we can fail to encourage our children. Kind of a flip side of the sarcasm idea, but we can fail to encourage them. Martin Luther, his father was very strict, even to the point of cruelty. And it was said that he wrote that when people say to spare the rod and spoil the child, that's true. But besides the rod, keep an apple in your pocket to give him when he's done well. It was a little bit of encouragement sometimes can do better than a strong rebuke. And the last one is we can spoil them, we can overindulge them. The literal translation for bring them up means to nourish or feed them. So training means discipline. So if we overindulge, we're really not nourishing or feeding them properly. And so, without the discipline, they won't mature properly themselves. Okay, I wanted to get to slavery here. Verse 5. Let's take a look at verse 5, 5 through 9. Again, Christian religion's been under attack because there's no specific teaching against slavery in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And the same people who attack Christianity are the same people who excuse other world religions who are also silent on slavery at this time, or also maybe some of them even practice slavery in parts of the world. And, you know, the people who criticize Christians will say, well, you know, it's okay for this other group to do it because it's part of their cultural diversity, you know. You hear stuff like that. But again, there's a little bit of history lesson I think that will help us about slaves in this time of the world. Slavery was a legitimate, necessary part of social order. Severe laws punished anybody who attempted to interfere with slavery, the institution. And so it's not surprising that neither Jesus nor the apostles attacked the institution directly. But Jesus' emphasis on the importance of every soul, the church's recognition of the brotherhood of all Christians, and the idea of everyone being equal under the eyes of God, that was revolutionary. And I think that planted the seeds for reorganizing all societies, particularly the Christian ones, in predominantly Christian nations. When Paul wrote about the duties of slaves and masters in the Christian church, he was talking about a vast number of people. Since this time, it was estimated that the Roman Empire, there were 60 million, that's with an M, 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. There was a kind of disease that had infected, the time Paul wrote, the whole Roman society, and the idea was that people didn't work. You know, it's kind of like sort of after COVID, people kind of got out of that habit sometimes of not working, you know, the same way that they did before. But working idleness was a real problem in the Roman Empire for the very highest classes. It was beneath the dignity of a Roman citizen to do real work. So practically all work was delegated to slaves, teachers, doctors, even the closest friends of the emperors who advised them, handled their administrative and their financial affairs. All these people were slaves. It's amazing. So at times there were bonds of loyalty between slave and master, but for the most part, the life of a slave was grim. It was terrible. A slave was not considered a person, but a thing. Ancient writers said that there could never be relationship between master and slave because they have nothing in common. Aristotle said that a slave is a living tool. Slaves were looked at the same way that farm animals were looked at, except they could talk. That was the only difference. Greek philosophers, many said that slaves who were too old to work should be thrown out to starve to death. It was looked at as foolish at this time if a slave got sick, and they should not get full rations because they are not doing their full job. Gaius was a famous Roman lawyer writing at the time of Paul, and he said that we must note that it is essentially accepted that the master possesses the power of life and death over the slave. If a slave ran away at best, he was branded on the forehead with the letter F for fugitive. Caesar Augustus, yes, that's Caesar Augustus, the one at the time of Christ, he had a slave crucified because he killed one of Caesar Augustus's pet quails. He had them crucified. Paulus executed a slave who had broken a crystal goblet, and he threw him alive in a pond he had stocked with savage flesh-eating fish. The poet Juvenal tells of a Roman woman who ordered a slave killed for no other reason than he made her mad. So it's against this background that Paul's advice to slaves was circulated in the early church. What he's saying here is very revolutionary. He's addressing slaves as human beings first. He's elevating them to heights that not found in any other ancient writings. He's saying they're humans and they have choices and they can decide. So how does he say slaves are to obey their masters here?
Like they obey Christ.
Just like they obey Christ. That's powerful stuff. That's really powerful stuff. And that's hard. It's hard in this instance. Notice he doesn't he doesn't tell them to rebel, but he tells them to be Christians where they are. The term earthly here he uses, don't skip over that word earthly. That's really important. If you see it and read it with a literal eye, it indicates that Basically, the social status of this world is not the social status that exists in the universe, in God's thinking. Let me ask you this. What does fear and trembling mean? Verse 5. He says, don't do it out of fear and trembling. I've just read you some horrible stuff. Told you about some horrible stuff. How slaves were treated. But is that what he's talking about here?
Maybe a little, but that's the reality of a bondservant or a slave at this time.
Yeah.
And I think the message in this whole section is that your motivation should be focused on God and on Jesus as your Messiah, and in the Lord. That should be why you do what you do, whether it's parents, whether it's children, whether it's owners, workers, whatever. That should be the fear and trembling focused on God, less on your earthly situation.
Right. Almost reminds you to work out your own salvation.
Yeah.
You know?
I was just going to mention that verse. We're going to faith with fear and trembling.
Mm-hmm.
That's as important to us today as it was back then.
Yes.
Back in the day when Israel was its own nation, more or less, they did not regard their law with fear and trembling, but took it under advisory, and often did was right in their own eyes.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Remember, what judgment you judge, you'll be judged.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think he's telling the masters, if you got to be, not show mercy and grace to these servants,
Mm-hmm.
your master's gonna, your Father in heaven is gonna judge you there.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. You know, he's saying to be anxious to please your master. Being anxious to please your master. All right? Work hard at it. You know, let it not be out of terror or something like that. And don't be a man pleaser or a woman pleaser in this, you know, in our male or female boss. But don't be a person pleaser, but do it basically from the motivation of I'm doing it, as has been said, for Christ. And I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. There's a great example of a man pleaser that was different in his master's eyes than he was really. You remember the old story of Gehazi in 2 Kings 5. Remind you, he's the servant of Elisha, you know, the story about Naaman comes down and doesn't want to dip in the Jordan River to cure his leprosy. And, you know, Elisha, first of all, he rebels against it. Then finally, they talk him into going and dipping in the dirty Jordan River 7 times. He's healed of leprosy. Naaman, the Syrian, is thrilled, and so he's going to give a lot of great rewards to Elisha. Elisha says, no, that was God's work. That's not me. Take your stuff and go back to Syria. Well, Gehazi heard that, and he wasn't so sure about that. So he tracks down Naaman on the way back to Syria and says, regarding those rewards, I like a few of those, right? And so, you know, of course, Gehazi was punished that way. But that's the idea. You know, he was probably a great servant in front of Elisha, but, you know, behind his back, maybe not the best. Okay. One thing that Paul doesn't say here, he doesn't say masters free your slaves. He doesn't say slaves rebel against your masters. And there could have been a tendency when slaves, or at least particularly slaves, heard this gospel message about freedom and equality. But he doesn't say that. He basically says, do things in the circumstances where you find yourself. You know, being a Christian didn't offer them an escape at this time from circumstances, but I would say it would offer them a triumph over circumstances. Ryan.
Back then, as now, he's equipping Jesus and the apostles after him were equipping the disciples to, have the mindset you're going to be in a sinful world, you're going to be surrounded by sinful people, act accordingly.
Exactly.
And as to principle of freedom and slavery, if some point in history, Rome did eventually release all their slaves, and it wasn't by command. It was because Christians gained so much influence in the empire, and concept of treat your slaves well became part of the culture. Keeping slaves became expensive.
Right, yes.
And eventually it stopped having slaves for a certain amount of time because they're too expensive to keep.
Right. What about a callous servant, a callous master? Was this somebody who was ungrateful? What do you say about that? Does this apply here?
Yes, it seems to, yes.
It very much seems to, right. Let's slip, we're out of time, but revolutionary teaching. Let's talk about verse 9. Look at verse 9. Why is that revolutionary?
Do the same to them. I mean, he's really, you treat them the way you want to be treated, is what he's saying.
What is that? What do we call that? The golden rule, right? He's applying the golden rule to masters. That is, I can't tell you, we lose that in our culture today when we read this. We just go right over it. But I can't tell you how revolutionary what he did here. He's saying that there should be mutual respect and accountability between master and slave. And there are obligations that both of them have to each other. It doesn't go one way. It doesn't go to the masters here. And this is kind of, again, the parallel to parents and children. He also is sort of saying here, don't exasperate your slaves. Don't threaten them. You know, he says, he's kind of, again, planting the seeds for, this is the way people are to be treated. They're real people. They're not living tools, as Aristotle said. They're not farm animals with a voice. You know, they're human beings and they're worth it. And particularly when you add that they're fellow Christians, whoa, now you're really developing that idea that these people are equal in the sight of God. Because I said before, earthly, that's an important view. Earthly. Paul is saying here, you've got earthly, you know, basically this person's your earthly master. I didn't get it. I wanted to apply this to the workplace today. It's where the last part of this lesson was going. But the idea is you have an earthly master. But what that says also is that master is just your earthly master. Because both of you have a heavenly master. And that heavenly master is really, in the scheme of things, all that counts. That's all that counts. So that's the way you look at that. Okay. I was going to talk a little bit about the Christian worker and how that applies to us today. You know, some of these principles I think probably do apply the way we approach our work and the way we approach our boss. And sometimes we don't. I think I've always said I've had some really great bosses in my life. I've had some not so great bosses in my life. I learned actually probably more from not so great bosses. Again, particularly in you know, teaching school, the business school, it's really, you know, you probably learn more from bad bosses because you can say, that's not how I wanted to be. That's not how you should be. So that's an important thing. But there are a lot of things about the way we approach our work. And the idea here that Paul says is you approach your work not as you're working for your master. Yeah, please your master. Please your boss. But think about you're actually working. When you do a good job, you're doing your best work. When you're putting your effort in, you're also working for Christ. And that puts it in a whole new perspective, a whole new idea there. So 4 lessons for today, real quick. Children, parents, masters, slaves. The idea is mutual subjection. Number 2, everyone in these relationships should behave as if they were serving God. Number 3 is rank and status in the world is not relevant. Number 4, love regulates the duties of both parents and children, slaves and masters. Equality of nature and faith are superior to rank. Christianity makes all brothers. The golden rule rules. And so I think these ideas are terribly revolutionary, even today. Okay. Let's have a word of prayer. Our Father, we're thankful for all the blessings that you give us. We're thankful for these 2,000-year-old words, Father, that Paul wrote, that you directed with your hand. Father, help us to realize that you are the master. You are in charge of everything. You are in charge of our lives. And we pray, Father, that we will accept our circumstances as we find them, and that we will, with you and your guidance and your love and your mercy, we will overcome the circumstances we find. We're just so thankful, Father, that you are our Father and we can call you our Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hmm?